Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next Sweet Spot Safari. I can't believe that this is number 17. And today we are very lucky to have with us Mel Luck, who is got a glittering career and is currently a resilience coach, but she's going to tell us more about what she's done historically and lead into the conversation around safety and risk, which we think is highly relevant today in all sorts of different contexts. And as always, we'll be having an informal discussion based on a few questions, and hopefully we'll end up with a sweet spot around that area. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Melissa, and she's going to explain a bit about her background and history and what's currently driving her. So
thank you, John. Yeah, it's lovely to be here chatting to you too. I know it's going to be a good one, having met you both already. So yeah, as you rightly say, I'm a resilience coach. My aim is to help people live happier lives and to overcome their self-limiting patterns, whether it's by mental health and fitness coach as well, however you want to call it. But my background is very different to that. I started off in life very much wanting to be involved in everything aviation. That's how I started. So I worked in a hangar working on vintage aircraft as a mechanic. I refueled them, I washed them, I worked in air traffic, I worked in operations, you name it. I got involved and worked my way up, got my private pilot's license and then my commercial license. I flew corporate jets and then the airlines latterly, and also did display flying. So I really did come at it at all angles, and that was where I thought I was going to be for my life and my career. The way I then got to coaching was within the airline. I became a crew resource management instructor. It's basically teaching human factors to all air crew, so pilots and cabin crew, because most crashes happen because nowadays, because the aircraft are pretty reliable, but people make mistakes when you're working long hours, fatigued in a high pressure environment. People don't work together very well, and they rub off badly on each other and sometimes make bad decisions. So I was a facilitator for crew resource management. I then got very ill. I got a chronic illness and injury following a variety of crashes. I had a mountain bike crash and got concussion, and then a week after that I recovered from the concussion. I was a passenger in a car crash, and my body just went, you know what, I can't do this anymore, and a switch turned off in me that has never quite fully turned back on since. And that started my journey to understanding that I had to really connect back to my mind and body to get better. I had to really understand how I ticked and the mind-body connection with that. And I realized how much of my past and some trauma had just sort of affected how I pushed as hard as I had to get where I had, and how I was struggling to ask for help to recover. And then equally, I'd loved the facilitation work I've been doing within the airlines, and I've been headhunted to do some other work around that training with health services. So I started getting into that work, and here I am doing mental health first aid training as well, because I think mental health has become such an important thing to talk about, but I think it does need to be talked about in the right way. So I really like bringing that into my work with organisations as well, as a sort of just culture and coaching. And yeah, very roundabout way to get somewhere I didn't expect, but I really love it.
So what a fascinating career. And I really like the idea, as you're saying, is we need to talk about it, but we need to talk about it in the right way. And I'm sure that's going to come out in the conversations that we have. So I'm going to start with quite a big question and lead into debate. So the question I've got is, and you know, I have a background in process safety and risk as well, so another reason why this resonates with me. But you know, is there such a thing as total safety? You know, whether it be physical, because I know that will resonate with you in your previous career in the airline industry, which is very important, but also in the transactional space and in the emotional space. Is there something that is, you know, can we be truly safe?
I think it's a brilliant question. Definitely putting me on the spot. However, actually, I think it's a really easy answer from my perspective, which is no. I don't think there is. I don't believe there is. And I think because it is about perspective. It is about what someone perceives as being dangerous. I mean, certainly aviation is never safe. You can't take anything into the air, and no matter how much risk management you do, mitigation, that's not safe. And yes, it's one of the safest forms of transport because of the work that's done around making something unsafe as safe as it can possibly be. But I mean, I think there's so many threads that you could go off to from your question. The one that came to mind as being the most recent is obviously things like the lockdowns we just had, trying to keep people safer, but then we look at the other effects, negative implications that's had on people's physical and mental health, trying to keep their physical and mental health well. I think sometimes trying to keep people safe can make them less safe in other ways. And there's so many angles I can think of this, so I'm not going to talk too long. I'll let you respond.
Well, yeah, I think that's great. I'm actually on this occasion, I'm not going to respond. I mean, that does absolutely resonate with me. And again, I think it will come out. I'm going to let Ben respond, because I know some of the things, the concepts you've talked about, and particularly about perspective, which we'll come on to later on, is so important. So Ben, I'd be interested to hear your reflections.
Yeah, so I think so I am interested in the lockdown part, because what you just raised was what I think as well, that there are trade-offs. Having absolute safety comes at a cost of other values, and other types. So there isn't just this kind of linear way of approaching problems. So I think that resonates with me. But I'm just interested really in your reflecting back on, maybe, if I don't know if it's too crude to have like two halves of your career. So your aviation, adrenaline fueled part of your career, and then the kind of more latter bit where you've been recovering from your injury and you've taken on new role. How has your perspective of safety and risk changed? And there's obviously an age factor, I think, at play here. But just really, what was your kind of personal and professional perspective of those two different polarities?
That is such a good question, because I'd forgotten until you asked. When I was sort of in that career, in that place where I was not only flying commercially, but I was track daying motorbikes, I was riding off-road motorbikes, riding mountain bikes. I was full on adrenaline junkie, and I remember having a competition with a group of friends, and we said, right, let's do something this year that scares us. So they all came up with things that scared them. All the things that they wanted to do that scared them were things that I already did. So I took them flying, I took them on the back of motorbikes, I took them to do these scary things, and I thought, I can't honestly think of something that scares me. But in hindsight, that's because I had such a dysregulated nervous system based on living from childhood trauma and that being my norm, that I craved the adrenaline to feel normal. So I didn't have consciously any fear. And in a way, aviation was the one place that I enjoyed the framework to work around, to make something that is inherently risky professional and as safe as it could be. But I guess I was still doing what is inherently a risky job. And also it was so quick. I mean, I worked for a low cost airline, so we would turn around maximum 400 passengers in 25 minutes. So we'd get them off in the aircraft, do a security sweep, get another 200 back on and go again, whilst refueling, doing a walk around, that kind of stuff. So although I was doing something very safe and very professional and very rigid, it was also intense and still high adrenaline to a certain extent. So that was the one half where I was just, I didn't feel like anything was particularly unsafe, to the extent that even I wore the minimum safety equipment until I injured myself, and then I would always wear a bit more safety equipment for whatever I'd already injured. So I was very poorly informed about risk. But like you rightly say, there's a lot around youth around that and thinking you're invincible. That moment in 2010 when the switch got switched off of me and I suddenly realized I was not invincible, and the journey that made me realize quite how damaged mentally and physically I was, that had led me to that point, has completely flipped how I feel about things. And we talked about it a bit when we were talking earlier, but I think it comes down to intention. Is that now I will do things more intentionally, and I will see the risk and go, yeah, but I'll enjoy it anyway. And I will decide what I want to mitigate and how much of a risk it's worth. I mean, for instance, I rode around the Nürburgring, and I mountain biked it, I drove it, and I rode my motorbike a couple of times around it. And I remember it's the only time in my life I went to do something and I thought, this could kill me. I 100% acknowledged about this could kill me. I'd seen crashes that day. I'd seen horrendous incidents that day. I knew how dangerous it was. And I went into it with a very clear knowledge that I was going to do the best I could, but I could be taken out by another driver and there's nothing I could do about it. And I think that was an in-between time when I was starting to get ill, but still functioning in a slight stress response, but I was being a bit more intentional. But now everything is about actually kind of loving myself, I guess. It's about saying, you know, I'm going to do something because I enjoy it, not because I need the adrenaline or the dopamine hit. And being intentional about how much risk I want to take for myself and also for things that are important to me in my life. You know, my husband, my sort of wolf pack, as we call it in our home. So I'm very much more intentional about how I treat my body and my mind and what is important to me. I still love risk. If I can get some more healing, I'd still absolutely love to ride off-road motorbikes. I really enjoyed that. But I wouldn't be doing it for the adrenaline factor and I think it was actually almost a form of self-harm, the intensity in which I did things before. Whereas now it would be for the joy with a lot more intention and understanding about how it will affect me, and also making sure I take rest before and after, and an intentional proper rest and things like that.
I think what you've described is really fascinating. I'm going to follow on about perspective thing in a bit later on, but while the topic is sort of hot in my mind, I'm wondering now is that, have you ever thought about how you would have been if you hadn't had those two close traumas in 2010, right? Because obviously that was a seminal moment for a flipping, to use your language, of your career and your intention and everything else, because that'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, it's a standard hero's journey, because much as I really would like to be better now, because I am quite limited in what I'm able to do, and there's so much I would like to be able to do, especially to help others now. It was very much what I needed. I was living in a very subconscious stressed state. I was just living purely in a stress response, and I suspect that something else would have happened if it hadn't been that, because I just don't think I would have been able to continue at that rate that I was. And actually, because I was so unkind to myself and I was living in such a sort of fight or flight response, I don't think I would have ended up in this field, because I was so unaware of myself. I really was unaware of myself, and therefore quite unaware of where others might be as well. So I think I could have quite happily stayed in that career, living subconsciously, just taking the money, sat on a pension, and just lived a very unconscious life, until it all finished. But I think the main difference is I wouldn't be as happy as I am now. I would be searching for my happiness in external things, and the dopamine hits and the adrenaline junkie things. And I think one of the biggest things I struggled with when I got sick so rapidly was my identity as a pilot or a biker or whatever it was. And I suddenly didn't have that. And the friendships I had based on that, because I wasn't that thing, I didn't do those things, I kind of lost them as well. So I lost a lot that wasn't just my health. And yeah, I think as I would have got older and lost those things anyway, I probably would have struggled more, because I'd have been able to do them for so much longer. I think it would have been harder to adjust out of that mindset. So I'm actually really grateful I got the opportunity to kind of really reassess who I am and what my life is about when I was young enough to make the change.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's something about serendipity there as well, isn't there? Around, because I've seen people possibly not as intense as your previous career, but doing similar in the racing community. And as you say, they really struggle later on in life because they physically and mentally, they're not in the same space, and it can actually put them, at risk, which actually leads on to another question, which is sort of slightly tangential, but I think interesting, is, earlier on in the conversation, you talked about perspective. One person's risk is another person's sort of nirvana, let's say. And there is no thing as you said, total safety. I totally agree with that. Otherwise we'd never go out of the front door or do anything. There is no such thing as zero risk. But what I'm finding interesting at the moment is that we're seeing there's a lot of debate about who should be the arbiters of safety now. If you think back to COVID, for instance, which again, Ben touched on and yourself earlier on, and you think about ULEZ, you think about the climate change, you think about the NHS, you can think about, and we had a very interesting discussion with the GP on the NHS last time, is that there's all these things that are potentially at risk or put us at risk, and reduce safety, but who should be the arbiters at the end of the day, because it feels sometimes, and I feel sometimes with the level of control we're seeing through, again, social media and algorithms, is that, are we walking into a nanny state through stealth, for instance? I know there's a lot of concepts there, but I'm very interested, where's the tipping point? Where's the balance point between, taking control of your own life and your own risk and having your own freedoms, right? And having other people do it for you for arguably the greater partly the whole vax, anti-vax argument as well, wasn't it? So.
Oh yeah, really, really good point. So much that comes up with me in that, and I think that's one of the things that I find hardest about it, is that control thing, is who decides. I mean, I think about it from the airline perspective. I can think about decisions that we were told to make that were maybe not told to make. We were encouraged, we were nudged to make because it would save the company money. And the old crusties, which even I was in my time, we called ourselves, the people with a bit more experience would often say, no, my primary role here is the safety of this aircraft and the people in it. So I am not going to do what you're asking me to, because I know it saves you money, and I know that I won't have a job if we don't have a company. So I realize I need to do things as economically as possible, but my primary role is not economy, it's the safety of this aircraft. So I, is in that role, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to. I'm going to do something a bit safer, because that's what my experience tells me. And I think when you look at lockdowns and things, you look at the financial side of things. I think if ever anyone has a financial benefit from saying this is safe or unsafe, then we really have to start to consider if they're bringing our best interests at heart. The thing that came to mind just as I was saying that was very recently, I used to do triathlons, and there was, I think it was the Belfast, it was, I think it might have been Belfast triathlon, it was Ironman, very recently. It's only been in the news a few days ago, over the weekend, I think. And there were massive swells in the sea. It was a sea swim for the swim, massive swells in the sea, and people were saying, like, we can't swim this is ridiculous. But of course, from the organizer's point of view, I presume, and I am making assumptions, I haven't looked into it that deeply, but obviously as an organizer, they're going to want to go ahead with it. And 2 people died in the swells. And people are going like, it should never have gone ahead. They should never have said it was safe to swim. So people are going, well, you're not going to do this, are you? And they went, no, it's safe to swim. So off they went. And part of me goes, well, okay, these people have made a wrong decision because they had probably a financial side to it they were considering, and obviously a timescale side to it they were considering. But then I look to, as you said, this nanny state. I really think we're being taken out of our own power quite a bit now, of being able to make our own decisions. We're being ruled so minutely in so many ways now that we're forgetting that we have a decision to say what we believe is safe and what isn't safe for ourselves. And like you say, it's perspective. So what is safe for one person may not be safe for another. So for some of the swimmers who struggled in that water, that wouldn't have been safe for them. There would have been some who might have thought it was perfectly safe, but that's on them. My husband went through a haircut recently, and the hairdresser was complaining that their mate had gone on holiday, and the airline had let them go on holiday, and there were the wildfires, and they were complaining the airline shouldn't have let them go. And he was like, but their job is to take you where you want to go. You make the decision if you want to go there. That's not on them. And I think that's the sort of the world we're starting to go into, is that we are being so over managed, and there's so much too much safety. It's almost being camouflaged now, isn't it? Everyone has to wear a high-vis vest. There's signs everywhere, and we've become blind to it, and yet we expect someone else to tell us what to do rather than deciding for ourselves. And I think that's becoming quite dangerous.
I think you're right. I mean, there's always a payoff between productivity. You know, you talk about financial, but you could relate that to productivity and safety, and that's the previous history of my work and my job. But what I think philosophically I'm finding interesting is, I love the expression you said, the crusties, right, which were, you know, the people with the experience. I think there's another dichotomy going on at the moment as well, where people are saying, you know, if you're smart enough, right, you're old enough, which I get. You know, it is about skills over maybe pedigree. I saw a good post the other day from Allard about that. But there's also no substitute for experience either. You know, if you go back to your analogy with the swimmers, right, and in the Belfast Triathlon, and what I see at the moment is almost there's a danger where experience is being overridden, right? And we see that in all sorts of sports or manufacturing or whatever, and, you know, motorsports specifically. If you look at the history of Jackie Stewart, for instance, who was a leading light in the whole safety campaign for Formula One, and yet he won the World Championship 3 times. So there's an element there, and that itself is quite scary, because what I see is we see the minutiae of you described of the nanny statism of safety, right, versus almost missing the big picture. It's a bit like, you know, looking at the needle but not looking at the haystack, and I see a lot of that going on. I just wonder whether there is a place for experience, because it feels as though experience now doesn't have the same as in certain cultures, right? It's not in all cultures. Experience doesn't have the same impact or resonance as it used to have, right? And I think that in itself can be dangerous, because what we need is the smart and experienced people making the decisions, right, rather than the process and the systems and the tick boxes making the decisions for us, you know.
Yeah, it's so true. I think we touched on it earlier, but we're in such a fast moving world, aren't we? And I think that progress, that push for fast progress, is quite overriding in what is perceived as successful people who are pushing the boundaries. And that's quite juxtaposed to the people who are experienced, going, well, I've been around this rodeo a few times, and for for these reasons I don't think that's going to work. And a lot of the progressives don't want to hear that. And sometimes you have to. I think that it's a difficult balance, isn't it? This is another sweet spot thing, is that sometimes you do have to ignore the experience, because you go, okay, we're in a different world now. So, you know, your experience doesn't say that it won't work, so we have to push through it. That's a difficult balance, isn't it? I can understand that is a difficult one to work out, where you listen to the experience and go, okay, they know it won't work because they've been through this loads of times, or where you go, yeah, I know it didn't work for you 20 years ago or 10 years ago, but actually we're in a different world now and we think this will work and we have to push forward with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Ben. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking that all societies seem to go through cycles. And in part is to do, it might be a cultural level, it might be a technological level, it might be an economic level, and you know, there's, when you kind of at the beginning, there's almost like this entrepreneurial risk taking, and it feels like what we've had in recent decades, although we've had lots of novelty, which I think safety is maybe a response to lots of new technologies, we've had a lot of stagnation. And so I'm wondering whether this sort of stagnation is almost like the end of this like cycle of where the UK or the West has grown, and we've got new tools, but we haven't got really a new anything else. We haven't got new values, new ideas about actually how we use them, and almost this kind of this reach for safety is to basically protect what we have. And actually, what we kind of need really is to embrace some sort of appropriate risk, you know, individually and collectively, to kind of push through. Because I feel that, yeah, maybe, and safety's everywhere. You know, safeguarding, psychological safety, safe spaces. You know, are these just a natural response to where we are in this cycle, in this period of change?
That's a really good point. What came up with me when you said that, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, you know, we can take a man to the moon, but we can't have a conversation with the person next to us. And I feel like sometimes these pauses almost because technologically we are quite advanced in some ways, but I think as human beings we are really struggling with the technological advance, and I wonder if that's where these pauses have to come in. I think you're right about that, the nervous system side of it as well, and safe spaces and things. I wonder if part of it is because we, especially with this, I mean, this is fantastic, we can talk to each other from different places around the country, around the world, and different time zones, but if you're struggling, it doesn't take away from the need to actually interact with a real human being, and to maybe have a hug from them, and to really interact with their energies and look into their eyes. This doesn't replace that. It's a good, if you can't have that, it's a good way to go, okay, well, we've got something. But yeah, I do wonder if a lot of these real sort of pullbacks are us as human beings that take a long time to evolve, going, we are nowhere near evolving quick enough for the technology that we're using. And maybe that's why all this talk about mental health and safe spaces and safeguarding is coming in.
I think it's really interesting because also that leads in, your Ben's point is fascinating, and your response is about disenfranchisement, right? And I think I remember writing a paper a few years ago about the whole how technological advancement will benefit the people who can cope with technology. The people who can't are going to be left behind. And then it also becomes a sort of self-fulfilling acceleration in terms of getting faster and faster. So if you look at the current things going on at the moment, the cashless societies, one for the moment, there's a bit of a kickback against that because, and I get that totally, I can use both, but I there are times where I really want to use cash, right? I actually don't want to do an electronic transaction because it's just unnecessary and difficult. And it's interesting where the arguments come up as well for people justifying a cashless system. The banks are justifying on the basis, well, it's going to eliminate tax fraud. Well, I don't actually think it is, to be quite honest. And this is a silly one, but I mean, I was at actually a stag do in Cambridge at the weekend. I know I'm sort of a bit old for these sort of things, but really, do we need an app to tell us how we're going to split the money and do all that sort of thing? It was way more complicated than using cash. And yet, of the sort of 8 out of the 10 wine bars and pubs we went into the weekend wouldn't take cash. It's totally cashless. Now you get the efficiency angle, but actually cash is quite easy because we can just hand notes over, and there's also an emotional connection to a certain extent of handing a note over, which is, again, maybe to your point, Mel, is the human connection piece. It's a bit like handing over a business card. I had a situation the other day where I'd filled my daughter's car full of petrol because she needed to go somewhere, but she was taking her mates, and her mates very kindly offered her fuel money. And she said, "Dad, do you want the fuel money back?" I said, "Well, it doesn't really matter, but if you're offering, so if you've got £5, I'll just take a £5." She said, No, it was an electronic transaction. I said, I can't be bothered.
Yeah.
It's just too much aggravation. So there's all these things going on in the background at the moment, and I'm a great believer in beware the unintended consequences. And I do wonder now, it's because we're going so fast, we're not thinking about the unintended consequences, which is where the experience piece comes in and say, well, hang on, can we stop and think? I know we all like the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. That's an exact example of that, how cognitive bias can take us in a totally wrong direction because we are in that fight or flight mode, the type 1 brain, and we're basically isolated the processing part of the brain, the thing that would analyze the situation and stop the unintended consequences. So I think there's lots of connections there. Any thoughts or reflections on that, either of you?
I was interesting because I thought, with cashless society, again, we're back to risk versus safety. They're saying it's a good idea because there's risk, and it's safer to have a cashless society. But again, this is a different slant on it. Was, well, whose risk? Because it's we don't have a risk. I mean, there's far more risk of us having our digital identity stolen as individuals and not being able to make any digital transaction than there is of us having our wallet stolen, a little bit of cash taken, but we can just get more cash. I mean, having our whole digital identity stolen, our digital and our bank account, or not being able to take out cash or money from our account is far more of a risk than having cash. So it's again to who controls what's safe, because in this instance the risk is for, you know, the bankers, the people who might lose a small amount of money if you have some fraud, or if you don't pay all your taxes or whatever. But there are people out there who will rely on cash. I saw something the other day that said, you know, what about a wife and mother who's in an abusive relationship, and the only way they can try and escape it is to squirrel away cash, because if the husband has control of their bank account, it's the only thing they can have control of is cash. And if they go, right, I'm going to escape this abusive relationship, so I'm going to take my child, he's away this for like an hour, I've gradually been squirreling his cash away, I'm going to go to the bus stop, but then they don't take cash, then what? You're taking away someone's ability to have freedom, because anyone can control a digital account, but you can have control of your own cash. So I feel like that's one of these things where a bigger organization, you know, decides it's risky to them, but it's not for the benefit of the individual, because for individuals it's control for what we have, and they're trying to take control of that. So I absolutely can see benefits, and obviously we all find it easier. I mean, you know, just it's dangerous, isn't it? Swipe something and you've paid. It's terrifying sometimes, and of course it's easier, but when it comes to your own control of yourself, I feel like that's what's being taken away, whether it be cash or just our own ability to make a decision on what we feel is safe or not.
Yeah, and I think just touching on the digital world, which, you know, we're not really designed for the digital world. The digital world works in ways which seems kind of counterintuitive to how our, you know, minds and bodies work. You know, there's some good aspects clearly, but there's some challenging ones. And I'm just wondering how all of this access to information has what the impact that's done on our perception of risk and safety, because, you know, I have to have very clear boundaries. I don't read news sites. I have LinkedIn, and that's it. But you know, there's a reason why the best psychologists work at advertising companies or social media firms or technology companies, because there's ways to hack our minds. And I'm just wondering, actually, are we overvaluing kind of a lot of risks and trends, and, you know, misinterpreting actually how dangerous some things are, you know, in the world? Actually, if we were to have more local, and this is the bizarre thing, isn't it? We don't really know the names of our neighbours, but we know everything about a celebrity's life the other side of the world. Actually, if we knew more local people, had more local conversations, would our perception of you know, safety and risk change if we traded that for just loads of time on the internet?
Absolutely. Oh my word, so much came up in that. The fact that, you know, social media companies call us users, it proved that it's addictive. Like they are designed to pull on how our brains work. Like I say, psychologists make it so that we are drawn to use them. I did see a graph literally when smartphones came in, mental illness just went exponentially up. And I think you're right that ability to see so much and compare to so much we're not designed to do it. You know, we're designed to live in our little communities. We have to remember that we haven't grown as quickly as technology, like you mentioned earlier, and we are still working with a quite primitive sort of caveman brain that works with threats that are going to be something trying to kill us, and we have to go and hunt, gather, and work as a community to look after each other, and that's how we're designed to be. And I think you're absolutely right that, you know, you look at the wording that is used in the news or on social media, and to try and get us interested. I mean, a newspaper won't sell unless it can sell something interesting, and good news is not sell. So they have to use the fear response, don't they? They have to use shock and awe. But even in marketing, we're told, aren't we, to get that gripping headline that grasps their attention, you know. And it all works to a stress response. So I'm absolutely not surprised that we have such high rates of mental illness and struggles with mental health, because everything that we are subjected to daily is designed to work to a stress response, and marketing is designed to work to a stress response. It's something that I've had to grapple with in my business, because I've decided that I don't want to work to a stress response. I don't want to do, I'll buy now, this will end soon, this sale is ending, you must do it now or you won't get it. You know, it's I'm so insistent that we have to work to a calm stress response, and to work to regulating ourselves and connecting as human beings, that working to what the rest of these companies are doing to get our attention and get our monies is not conducive to a happy community.
It's really that as well, as you say. If you look at a lot of, you know, I work for previous companies that sell products, and a lot of the marketing is on based on fear. If you don't buy this, this will happen to you, you know, whether it's, you know, a protective product, you know, in the safety space or any other thing. And that is, as you say, fear-based marketing. And but what's really interesting is if you can flip that, and I totally agree with you about marketing. That's one of the areas that you know, we're withdrawing in our business, is that and it's absolutely proven that if you can flip from a fear-based response to a value-based response, and it can be the same concept, then not only will people feel happier, but it's a lot more sustainable, the change. You know, we've done that historically when we were doing safety training around PPE, for instance. You know, if people move away from the I'm wearing the PPE because I'm told to wear the PPE, to, you know, if you take safety safety goals, for instance, to actually, I've only got one set of eyes, and if I don't, you know, if something happens, you know, it might be low probability, but it's a high consequence event, i.e. lose my sight, then all of a sudden it changes. So I think, as you say, that's really interesting. But I want to come back to this business about, you touched about the control, right? And the collective, because I think, and, you know, we touched on early on, you know, about, you know, the potential for nanny statism, and how either large corporations or governments or whatever, you know what I mean, are doing it in their best interests, you know what I mean, to potentially elicit more control. What I'm finding interesting at the moment is the workplace has shifted. We've moved more to the gig economy, we've moved more to freelancers and stuff, and away from corporations. And when I look in places like LinkedIn, there's feels to be a lot of negativity towards large corporations. You know, people are disengaging with them. You know, the Gen Zers are moving away, and they're questioning the value of a corporation. But what I find is quite interesting is that as that happens, then, and we become more of a freelance economy, what collective power or influence do we really have? So if you look, without being political, but if you look at the recent strikes that we've had this year, you know, the teachers, the doctors, you know, and the train drivers to a certain extent, you know, whether you agree with them or not, they have that ability to have a collective response, right? You know, and kick back. But as we move more into the gig economy and away from that, and we all become isolated, right? There is no collective response, you know, or even if we're working for a corporation, but we're all working from home, away from each other and connected, right? If there is something that we don't like because we see it's going to have a negative material effect, not just on us as individuals, but maybe the future of the corporation. Go back into what you were saying earlier on, you know, when you were looking at safety, you know, actually, I want this company to survive. So I'm taking a tough decision not to take an inverted commas shortcut. That ability is changing. And I just wonder whether that we're consciously sleepwalking, or unconsciously sleepwalking into an area where that we're losing a level of collective power, but also losing individual influence and power, you know, and things are being masqueraded under the banner of, dare I say, safety and control.
Yeah, I agree with a lot you say. I've got a few points in it, but I'm wondering what if Ben has any responses, because I know I've heard a lot of my own voice recently, so I'm intrigued to see what you say to that.
No, I agree. Likewise, I agree with John's concern, and it is a conundrum. I think everything has trade-offs, and the more that organizations or countries or institutions pursue things like safety first, the trade-off is maybe less freedom. And then there's but the flip side is, if just everybody takes all risks all the time, that's not great either. And so there's there's a kind of balance, maybe with more risk taking, we need more responsibility, more accountability. And I don't know. I think just for me, the more we talk about safety, the more unsafe I implicitly feel, because it basically is almost like a response to, oh, everything's unsafe, and it's the implicit feeling I'm kind of getting, where any space I go into, there's basically the first thing that people introduce is some sort of safety form. And at the same time, I kind of think that avoiding risk altogether is risky. They're just my thoughts. I don't really answer John's question. I think it's just a really difficult one to square, and I suppose that's what the podcast is about. It's not necessarily having answers, but it's trying to get us to think about. We kind of just think that universal more safety is good, but is it?
No. And I think you're right. I mean, you were talking about the control side of it again, and I wonder if that goes back to how we're not working as communities anymore, and the control becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. We're now looking at World Economic Forum and World Health Organization, and you think, well, actually each community is different, each county is different, each country is different. People have different religions, different priorities, different ways of being, and we know that, whether it be as pilots or as business people, whatever. When you go to different countries, you have to interact with them as they do. You have to go into their standard sort of routine. Some things that you find normal, they might find rude, and vice versa. So I think we are being maybe not allowed to be as individual anymore, because it's such an overriding thing that's saying, well, this is safe and this is not safe, and I'm going to give you this rule as a whole that you must all abide by because it keeps you safe. And you think, well, you can't decide that. I don't think any single person or small organization can decide that for such a huge amount of people. But that's it's such a massive conversation, isn't it? Do you want to actually go back to smaller communities where you lead yourselves and you make your own decisions more, and you remove the bigger control?
It's really interesting you say that, Melissa, because I'm going to try and bring this out before I forget it. Is what you're saying is, with globalization, as you say, and expansion is huge, and I've worked in that space a bit myself, and the thing that comes to mind is the Geert Hofstede 6 cultural dimensions, right? Because actually, when you look at current tensions, of which there are, it is related to a certain extent of expansion and globalizations, because what people are fighting for is their culture and their values and their principles, right? That they've built up over a number of years. And then as companies expand, as governments expand, as organizations expand, then that they feel that those principles and values and everything else are at risk. It's not. I don't believe it's because A doesn't dislike B. Right? I don't think it's there's a competition or a conflict between people. I think it's erosion of principles and values, which we all know are very deep-seated, and embedded, deep inside ourselves. So I think that in itself is creating a stress. And the question is, how far does it go? And as you say, we're not going to solve the questions here today. Maybe we're just getting people to think. But the other thing that just came to mind about robustness and resilience and everything else. A couple of things, building on Ben. I know, Ben, you said you'd been to a workshop a couple of weeks ago or a few weeks back in Ipswich, and you were saying that you'd had a discussion afterwards about almost the overuse of the term psychological safety. We wind the clock back 4 years, as coaches, it was a big thing. Creating psychological safety was really important. And Ben and I discussed it last night. It's important to raise the awareness, but not take it too far, because the conversation, and I won't put words in his mouth, but what you shared with me was there was a private conversation afterwards saying almost the danger is by keep talking about psychological safety all the time, people naturally start to think that they're unsafe. Well, what's this about? Who actually haven't thought they were unsafe before, but all of a sudden, again, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I want to come back on to something Ben said about actually a bit of risk is a good thing, right? Because it helps us build, a totally safe space, doesn't help us learn. And there's a brilliant author, I keep mentioning him because I love his books, a guy called Nassim Taleb, who's a Lebanese mathematician and professor of risk. but I'm reading one of his books at the moment called Anti-Fragile, and they talk about this concept, and it can be in a physical, it can be in an emotional and transactional space of what they call anti-fragility. And basically that's, he's got basically three concepts: robustness, right? And then there's fragility, which are, quite easy concepts for people to understand. Something's either robust or fragile. And in reality, what he says in the book is, of course, is things are never as robust as people think they are. And he's got loads of examples. And again, things are not necessarily as fragile as people think they are. But the idea of anti-fragility is built on hysteresis, whereby a small amount of regular risk is good, not a huge amount, because what it does is it's a bit like our immune system. We're exposed to things, and then these levels of risk, we continually learning. Our brain learns, our body learns, and we start to deal with it. And actually, anti-fragility is a really good thing because it leads to more resilience as time goes on. And actually, I quite buy into that concept. But what I'd be interested in is in your work as a resilience coach, Mel, is do you see that at all? Do you see that playing out?
100%. I think it's so important, both in coaching, but also for my own health and recovery from chronic illness, because it's a huge balancing act, which I find really fascinating. I'll give you an example, bit out there maybe, but the Wim Hof ice baths. Everyone says ice is really good for stress. Everyone has to go and have an ice bath in the morning. It's really good for building your stress response. It is. It's really, really good. I can't do them. I used to do open water swimming year round. I could do ice baths until I reached my point where I absolutely crashed and my body couldn't take anymore. I still now can't do ice baths or open water swimming in the winter, because my nervous system is still so deregulated. It's too much for it. So the example I give is, if somebody, we know going to the gym is good. We know doing weights is good for you. We know any form of movement and physical training is good for you. But if you've got a broken leg, it's not good for you. You have to do gentle exercises to rebuild that. And then, you're going to have degradation of both that bone and the muscle around it. So you've got to gently build that up until you can get back to a state where you can then build strength. And I think it goes back to this doing it with intention and remembering why you're doing something, is that you have to work with somebody where they are. So yeah, you absolutely, what was the phrase you used? The anti-fragility.
Anti-fragility, yes.
Yeah, anti-fragility. So yeah, I think there's a risk of people trying to be too safe. I think, like you said, psychological safety, people forget that you create psychological safety so you can have arguments safely. That's the whole purpose behind it. Whereas people tend to have psychological safety, which means you never have arguments because that's not safe. It's remembering the intention behind it. And I think a lot of people go, yeah, get up at 4:30 a.m, hustle, do this, do that, and and you can push, you're more powerful than you realize, and you can do this, and go do cold baths and go and run 10 miles. This is good for you and you'll boost your stress response. But if somebody is in a completely deregulated state, you're just going to make them more deregulated. So it goes back to the individual. We keep on doing this thing where everyone goes, here's this blanket idea that you should all do because it will make you healthier based on what I did. and people go, oh right, okay, I'll do that because that will make me better. And then they get worse, and then they go, oh, it must be my fault. I must be the one that's broken because this thing that helped them didn't help me. Rather than saying, actually, we are all individual with different life experiences, different strengths and weaknesses, and we need to work from where we are personally. And you need to find, where your baseline is, and you can always build from that. So yes, absolutely, you can and should build from something. I know that I'm rebuilding my nervous system. I'm rebuilding my stress response. I know I need to put myself under physical and mental stress, but I need to be very intentional about it and know where my limits are, and then have intentional rest and re-regulation of it in order to build my capacity, so that I'm not trying to go back to where I used to be, which is living in a perpetual adrenaline fueled dysregulated state. So it's frustrating. I feel sometimes quite pathetic compared to what I used to be able to do, at how much I'm having to be quite careful, but I'm making myself stronger by doing that. And yeah, it goes back to that individual, doesn't it? It goes back to who's in control, who's telling somebody what to do, and the fact that we're all individual. But going back to your point, yeah, I think we the anti-fragility state point is incredibly important, and realizing that we are probably all more capable than we realize, but we have to meet ourselves where we are and build from a firm foundation. And sometimes that means undoing a really crumbly foundation that it wasn't built well in the first place, and rebuilding that strong and then going from it. You can't just go from someone else's sort of halfway up and try and build from where they say it will work from, because you're not the same.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because it sounds to me as though you flipped away from the fear, and you're actually building yourself on a set of values which will be more sustainable. So the other thing is the long-term game. You know, we've talked about unintended consequences and experience. What you're describing in your own state, both physically and mentally, sounds to me is that you are pushing for your own long-term sustainability, which means that, I guess, when you look back and use the word, you know, I felt a bit pathetic, that over time you will feel less pathetic, because you are actually building towards that personal long-term sustainability, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think society doesn't encourage that, because it's not the quick fix, buy now, next day delivery, dopamine hit that we're used to. It is deciding what our long-term gain is. And, you know, like I think I said to you before we start this, I'm so much happier now than I was when I was living on adrenaline, because I totally understand myself, and I totally, you know, I'm doing things for self-love, for self, you know, improvement, for self-help, rather than for sort of external validation or perception. And like you said, it's a long-term game, but it's certainly easier to work to our quick fix, dopamine hit society. It's certainly easier to say, yeah, I'm going out on a motorbike, I'm going flying, yeah, people going, oh, that's so cool. It's, you know, that's the life we live in, isn't it? You put something on Facebook, somebody likes it, we get the hit. It's this quick fix society is much easier than going, yeah, I'm going to live intentionally, and I'm going to live for a long-term goal. But equally, when we look at a sweet spot, you know, do you want to live till 110 healthily but not actually live and have excitement and have some danger? Or do you want to live till, you know, 65 but have lived a really exciting, fulfilled, full-on life? Where's the sweet spot in that? So it's another conversation.
Absolutely, that's great.
Yeah.
We're getting close to wrap up, Ben. So just a few reflections from you before we sort of close. I mean, this could go on forever, obviously.
Yeah, it's all really interesting, and I think the anti-fragility concept is really interesting, and it's interesting hearing your story, Melissa, about the ice baths. I'm probably not quite extreme, but I've been having cold showers for probably about, I don't know, 3 years now, and it's interesting. Your body adjusts to temperature, and so I can imagine it working in the opposite way as well. And so yeah, it's probably an unfair comparison to think about what you could do, but yeah, we kind of learn by comparing against, you know, other things, you know, either in our own lives or others. And yeah, so there's something around that, and there is something around, you know, I don't ride a motorbike, but I've been in the back of friends' motorbikes before, and there's something about time slows down. I feel focused, I feel calm, you know, similar to being flat out in the Autobahn. There's something about, actually, well, things are calm, and things feel focused, things feel effortless, and so we are all different. And so yeah, the temperature thing is interesting, because we kind of design for average. You know, everything's 21 degrees. And everything's kind of safe and comfortable, and we've kind of designed so many things which we don't even see or think about around kind of comfort and safety and average, that actually it's detrimental to a lot of people. And you know, some people might take inappropriate risks on motorbikes as a reaction or response to everything being kind of generic, average, and safe. So, you know, my kind of reflections are that yeah, we need safety. I tend to prefer maybe sometimes the word security, and we get security by being with others. I don't know. Maybe it's yeah, some semantics, but I kind of tend to think of security, but also this need for exploration. And so I kind of think back to humans, you know, how we evolved. We wouldn't be here if people didn't take risks do you think that people who are kind of crossing continents or oceans, or doing incredibly dangerous things, got out their kind of safety clipboard and thought, no, actually, this is not worth it. And so we wouldn't be here without risk takers. But at the same time, humans develop the prefrontal cortex more than any other animal, and part of its, or one of its main functions is inhibition. So it actually stops us doing things. And actually, if we're just taking risks and doing new things all of the time, actually society as a whole doesn't function. So there's this kind of real, I just think about this kind of real kind of not contradiction, but this real kind of tussle between exploring and taking risks, but then also not taking risks and not doing things, and having security. So they're just a few reflections, but I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, Ben, just listening. I think you've covered in that discussion a number of sweet spots, and what I found really fascinating today is that in this particular discussion, we've covered a number of potential sweet spots, right, without being absolute. So there's the trade-off point that you made, Ben, right? There's this point that you made, Melissa, as well, around fear and value. There's also another one around the collective versus the individual. So I think there's lots of different potential sweet spot there, and it is about balance, isn't it? It's about finding that, making sure I get a strong feeling that we go far enough to do what we need to do and push a boundary so we learn, but don't go too far. I have a very trite example of the collective, right, overriding the individual. Is having worked in corporates for years, every time there was any expense fraud, which is wrong and it needs to be dealt with, you get these reports, and you'd have 100,000 employees and there might be 2 or 3 expense frauds per month or something like that, is that they changed the system. And every time they change the system based on 2 or 3, rather than necessarily going hard and disciplining the individuals, they change the system because that's easy, right? And because they fear that it's going to happen again, when actually it's only 3 out of 100 people, right? And actually the financial risk compared to the markets and everything else is nothing. I'm not saying it's ethically right, it's ethically wrong. But every time the system gets changed, all the individuals suffer the pain of having to fill out more forms, do more electronic validation, double count, you name it, whatever. And nobody's sitting back and thinking about, again, the unintended consequences, which again, I think is another thing around the sweet spots. And we've talked about, capability versus experience. So I think there's a whole load of stuff there, which would be really fun. And I think personally, Mel, you've taken us on a really fascinating journey today in both sort of areas of your career and stuff. So any final thoughts from you before we close?
There's lots, but no, it has been very fascinating. I think the biggest thing that came up for me is the intentionality behind why something is being done, or the why behind it. I'm going to touch on a couple of bits, if I may, if we've got time.
Yeah, sure.
One is with the ice bath. This is just because it may be helpful to anyone sort of watching or listening this, because the ice bath is very useful, but we have to remember the intention behind it. So if you're doing it to anti-fragile yourself, to boost your ability to cope with stress, you don't have to actually immerse your whole body. The actual sensors you're trying to get to are right here, behind beside your eyes. So you can actually just put your face into ice water in a sink. So if you struggle with ice baths, and you can't warm up, which is what happens with me, my body actually goes into sort of stress response, and it overly gets cold, keeps on cooling down. You can put your face simply in ice water and just repeat that a few times, and you'll still get the same mammalian dive response, is what you're looking for, and you can still get the same, I think it's called thermogenesis, there's a name for it, the same response. And once you've then boosted your stress response by doing that, you can start to do the ice baths. So that's just something that might help anyone who's struggling with that, but also it's a reminder of what your intention is, and it goes back to social media. It's out there everywhere. Do the ice bath, but why are we doing it? Is it to be sort of with a trend, or what is actually the reason behind it? The other side of it was just that back to the psychological safety, and with aviation, by default, it was a very psychologically safe environment because we would make mistakes. It's a very high risk environment, so mistakes happen, and everything was monitored. Flight data monitoring happened, and if anything happened that was not, that could have been worse, or there was an instance of some sort, we would actually sit in our training days and go through the entire flight data monitoring, and we would look at what happened, how we could do it better. We might change a procedure. It might just be the awareness of looking at it would make me go, okay, you know, we won't, as an airline, we won't do that again. So I think that psychological safety side of things of going, yeah, like this is a risky thing we're doing, things are going to go wrong, but we're psychologically safe enough to discuss that and discuss how we could do it better next time. I found a really positive way to have a company culture, because like you said, Ben, you have to push, and I think that's the most important part of it. Is as human beings, we do have to push. We need something to do. I think it was Dr. Bruce Alexander's experiments with the rat parks, where if rats were in a cage and they had either water or cocaine, and they had nothing else, they would overdose and die drinking the cocaine or the heroin, because they had nothing to do. When you put them in an actual rat park and they had a life, which is more risky than just being in a cage, they didn't overdose. They either wouldn't have any drugs, or they'd only have a very small amount, because we do need to live. You know, the safety of just being in a cage of doing nothing is inherently bad for our mental and physical health. So I think that's the most important part of this, where the sweet spot lives, is we have to know with intention what we're doing, why we're doing it. But we need some risk, but we need to know, make the decisions ourselves. I think have that empowerment to know that no one else has to tell us what is safe for us. We have to try and get back in touch with ourselves and work out what we decide is risky.
So that actually then resonates back with the individual again versus sort of potentially the collective. I think this is a wonderful place to close. I wish we had more time to continue this, Mel. I really want to thank you, but I think the big takeaway for me today is the word intention and the why, because I think that the more I reflect on it, is all the other sort of potential sweet spots we've talked about almost feels as though it's overarched by intention. Intention is the thing that's potentially going to enable all those sweet spots, because it's going to help us think about why we're doing these things, where we want to go, and what the reasoning is behind it. So that's wonderful. So I'd love to say thank you to Mel today, our guest explorer. Has been absolutely wonderful. So please have a listen to our future ones. There'll be more coming in the pipeline, and we look forward to doing more, and you listening to our sweet spots. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Melissa. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.